Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the System 2 podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with my dear friend, Scott Mann. Scott has a really interesting story that he'll dive into, but the quick overview is he was a former Green Beret. He is an entrepreneur. He's given TED Talks that have gone viral. He's a best-selling author. But at his core, he's a storyteller. So Scott, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Matej. It's good to be here.
So tell us your story.
Okay. So let's see. I always start with the fact that when I was a kid, I really wanted to be John Rambo. That was my dream. But the reality was I looked more like Johnny Appleseed. I grew up in a little logging town in Mount Ida, Arkansas, and a runt of a kid, pretty bullied. And moved a lot, but Mount Ida was where I spent a lot of my formative years. And at 14, I met a Green Beret who came into our town. His name was Mark, and he was on leave from Special Forces. And as soon as I saw the guy, I knew that's what I wanted to be. I know that's what I wanted to do. And he was really, really influential in my life. Really cool guy. Sat down with me and took the time to explain to me what Special Forces were, and that their nickname was the Green Berets, and that they were very different from Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Army Rangers, these organizations that were very elite and that were essentially established and designed to go in and do quick strikes on targets, and that they would usually be on and off target, really fast, and they would do these missions by themselves. And Mark explained to me that what he did as a Green Beret was very different, that Green Berets could do some of that, but their real specialty was to work by, with, and through indigenous populations and to help them stand up on their own from the inside out. And that just, to me, Mateo, was fascinating, the way he talked about it. And he went on and he said, Scott, ever since World War II, there have been these complex, ambiguous situations again and again and again where it's required these specially trained advisors who can parachute in, they can offset, then they can walk into the chaos with just like 12 guys and connect at exactly the right spot with a village elder or a tribal chief. And then they immerse themselves in the language and in the culture and the environment, and they get surrounded on purpose, until the relationships are strong enough that they then mobilize those individuals to stand up against oppressive governments, regimes that are contrary to our national objectives. And, I always say Green Berets, they go in with 12 and they come out with 12,000. And they're kind of a combination between John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy. They're these relationship-based connectors who happen to be lethal. And that's just what I fell in love with. At 14, I just started obsessing at that point over, that's all I could think about was the day I could try out to become a Green Beret. And eventually did. When I went to college, got commissioned as an Army lieutenant, and then had to wait another 4 or 5 years before I could try out. But when I did, I had a hard time. I think I recycled every phase, multiple times. I was still a scrawny kid, but just stuck with it and eventually made it, and then spent about 18 of my 23 years in the Army in Special Forces, Central and South America in the 90s, doing the counter-drug thing, and then post 9/11, almost all of it in Afghanistan until I retired in 2013.
Wow. Can you take us back to that day when you met Mark, the Green Beret that came to your town? How did this even happen? Was he a friend of somebody's that or was he just a stranger? How did you actually get to talk to him?
Yeah, because our town was population 967. We didn't even have a stoplight. We're such a small town. Literally a wide spot in the road, in rural Arkansas. And this guy, there was a soda shop in the town, and the guy who owned it, his son was in Special Forces, and he had come home to visit. And that's how I met him. And then once I met him and I got the bug, I came to find out that our sheriff, our newly elected sheriff, was also a Green Beret who'd fought in Vietnam. And so between those two cats and a steady diet of Vietnam books on Green Berets, I just fell into that world. I just obsessed more and more about it, researched more about it. But yeah, he was there on leave, visiting. But here's the thing I'll tell you. And I don't think this is unique to Green Berets, and I don't think it's unique to Special Forces. You know, he took the time to sit down with a 14-year-old kid on his leave who, you know, you'd look at me and you'd go, yeah, that's not a candidate for Special Forces, right? But he saw something in me. He sat down and talked to me like an adult. And I couldn't, I mean, no one sat with me at lunch ever. I was about the most isolated kid you've ever seen. And he took the time to talk to me like I was a recruit, you know, and that had such a profound effect on me, Mate. To this day, I mean, I'm 57. If a young person contacts me about Special Forces or Rangers or whatever they want to do, I will drop everything and talk to them because, you know, we don't realize sometimes when we just take the time to see a young person and actually just listen to them and let them know that you know, we see them. There's no telling where that'll end up.
I love that. And it's such a interesting, like, I'm curious how you got from that scrawny kid who you've known would peg as being a special forces candidate to actually doing it. And we've talked about some of this in the past too, but just curious about, like, you know, like, what is it, right, that gets somebody to achieve something at such a high level when other people might not have seen that in them?
Yeah, I've often, you know, high performance fascinates me. It always has, regardless of the industry or the field. And and I've worked a lot in it, and I know you have too. But I mean, I've spent decades coaching D1 athletes, professional athletes, entertainers, CEOs, and you know what I find consistently is the opposite of what you would think these people are. I mean, first of all, they typically have some kind of story like what I just told. You know, they got their ass kicked a lot and they were led to believe that they couldn't do this thing, right? Or they shouldn't do this thing. And it was really a lot of times, like I know for me personally, going through special forces, for me, it was a dream. It was a vision that I had for myself that I knew was way bigger than me. I knew it was virtually impossible, but it kept me up at night. It scared the hell out of me and it just drove me. And I found myself, you know, just working so hard on it that when it finally came time to try out, I mean, yeah, it was hard, but I had worked and trained so hard that it almost felt like a relief to be in it. And even when I struggled and had to recycle, there was never really any doubt that I wasn't going to make it. It was a matter of when, you know. And then once I was in, it was everything I thought it would be. I got to be around these amazing sergeants and NCOs who were so phenomenal, and I got to go to these places that were, you know, places that I'd only read about as a kid, and now I'm there, standing on the shoulders of these amazing warriors. And sometimes I just had to pinch myself, you know, that I was there. So I think a lot of it just has to do with certain tenacity and just a belief in a vision or a dream and being unreasonable with yourself and the people around you, because I think that's the only way you can get to something like that is you have to be completely unreasonable.
Yeah. And yeah, and to your point, it's unreasonable, but it's also not giving up. Like you recycled a couple of times, right? Like
Yeah.
you could
Yeah.
have stopped, but
No,
you didn't.
right. And I mean, I will tell you that that probably taught me more the recycles where because, you know, that's demoralizing when you fail either academically or, you know, you don't perform a task to standard and you're told, okay, your rest of your class is moving on and you're staying behind. I can remember in Ranger School, which is a school that I went into before I went special forces, really hard school, take away your food, your sleep, and they just, you know, really test you to your limits for 9 weeks. And I recycled that. And my class had moved on and I was in what was called the gulag. And it was just basically a holding company for recycles until the next class came around like 2 months later. I mean, I spent Thanksgiving in the gulag in Fort Benning, Georgia. I remember they would give us just these crap assignments every day, like menial tasks to just see if we just quit. And one of them, I remember the lowest I ever felt was there's this obstacle course called the Worm Pit. And it's exactly what you think. Like it's full of mud and they make you crawl through this worm pit. It's awful. And I was assigned to pull weeds in the worm pit. So I'm out there in the worm pit pulling weeds. It's like a Vietnam rice paddy. And I hear this singing off in the background. To be an airborne ranger is the mark of a man. And I'm like, what? Because it's one of my favorite cadences in the world. And I hear it getting louder and these feet stomping. And I look and it's my original Ranger class marching onto the parade field for graduation rehearsal. And I'm sitting there like pulling these weeds. And I can remember tears were just running down my cheeks as I'm just pulling these weeds and trying to keep my head down so these guys don't see me. And, it was one of the lowest points of my life. And I wanted to quit so bad, but somehow I didn't. But like those moments taught me more about myself and about leadership and about combat even than the actual courses did. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that approach to anybody, but it certainly was a crucible for me, to figure out who I really was. And there were moments down the road where I was tested, and those tough moments are what kind of grounded me and let me know that I could lead through them.
I love the word recycle. That says so much more than if you just failed the thing or don't
Yeah.
move on. It says it all, right? You're there, you have another chance at it. So
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. And they do, I mean, and they do have, they have non-select, and do not return. It's called a DNR. Like you're not always a recycle. And I can remember telling my dad, because at the time, the other thing was too, I was assessed as a lieutenant as a quartermaster, which I won't get into the particulars, except that I really wanted to be an infantryman. And I was assessed as a logistician. And so was not what I wanted right out of the gate. And now I'm going to this elite school as a logistician, which is rare. And I knew if I went home, I would never get back to that course again. And this was before I tried out to become a Green Beret. So this was my one shot at kind of an elite track, and I knew it. And I can remember telling my dad on a payphone back when they had payphones of like, I can't come home. Like I have to stay here until I either graduate or they throw me out.
What did he say?
He was great. He was always, and he would have told me, I beat him to the punch because he was my biggest fan. Like he was the guy, because he was a runt as well, and had great athlete, went on to become one of the most reputable wildland firefighters in the country. And he did it all through tenacity, hard work. I mean, he was a kid from Appalachia that shouldn't have even gone to college. His dad had to sell a hog just for him to go to college. Like, just the ultimate grinder. And he always was the one that I would call whenever I recycled, which was all the time. And he would tell me, hey, Scotty, you got to stay. You got to stay until they throw you out. So this time I think I beat him to the punch. But yeah, he was always, about me staying in it and not quitting. That was the big rule in our family. You didn't quit.
I love it. Say more about the force multiplier aspect of the Green Berets. And yeah, it is very interesting to hear your distinction about it, where you're not going in doing a relatively like short operation, you're in or out, you're there for a long period of time, and you're surrounded by people that may not want to work with you.
Right.
How does that even feel to just land in a place where there's 12 of you and there's, like, to your point, 12,000 of them? How do you get the 12,000 to not turn on you?
Right. That's a great, great question. And the interesting thing about special forces is all of the things that you just described are by design. So every place you go is going to be like that for the most part, because that is your charter. Your charter is to be a combat multiplier for the nation. Your job is to mobilize surrogates to do our nation's bidding, and if necessary, to die doing it. You know what I mean? And so that's why I say it's a very difficult mission set. All elite units have difficult missions. I believe that the Special Forces mission set is very unique. It's the only one in the inventory like that where we do what's called unconventional warfare, where you are literally working by, with, and through indigenous populations to achieve strategic outcomes. And that's why those three avatars are so important that I said John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy, because on one hand, the John Wick piece, at your core, you have to be a commando. You have to be very, very proficient at your martial skills. You have to be able to go surgical strike on someone in a heartbeat. You have to be able to be sitting there drinking green tea one moment and then roll to your left and pull a pistol and react to contact. Like it's just the way it is. So there's the lethality that's your baseline, but then there's the Lawrence of Arabia. T.E. Lawrence was an archaeologist before he became a British intelligence officer in World War I, and it was his degree in archaeology and his experience in modern day Syria that allowed him to basically walk into that area during World War I and build relationships with the Bedou tribes that they couldn't even have relationships with each other. But he was such a catalyst that he could mobilize them and convince them through his storytelling and interpersonal skills to seize the city of Aqaba and take it from the Ottoman Turks from the desert, an impossible task. But it was his by, with, and through skills that enabled that to happen. And think about like what an ROI that is for the UK, and for the West. And so those Lawrencian skills are at the core of being a Green Beret. And then finally, the Verizon guy, this is the dude that you saw in the commercials that would pop out of a manhole cover. Can you hear me now? And then the next thing you know, he's in the jungle. Can you hear me now? And that's the other thing that a lot of people don't know about Green Berets is like they're very good at building networks that can amplify what they're doing at a local level for strategic outcomes. So they work very local, but it's just as common for them to walk into the deputy chief of missions office at the embassy and loop them into the network and build this thing out at a strategic level. So they're strategic connectors too. When you roll all that together, that's kind of the ingredients for what makes a Green Beret today. And it's a really cool combination.
Yeah, and say more about that. Like when you land there, how do you know you're not gonna just get turned on by these people? Like how do you develop that trust? How do you? Well, I guess your point, you're never quite sure. You always got one hand on the pistol, but like you still have to develop some kind of like rapport with them.
Yeah, because I mean, you're going into places that typically are radically different than you. They are completely absent of trust, social capital, infrastructure. They have fallen into chaos. I mean, that by definition, that's where you typically want to go. And so your job is going to be to go in there. You think of like I think French Indochina or Indochina during World War II. Think Nazi occupied Europe, right? Think the environments that you grew up in, right? Those are where Green Berets will typically insert themselves. And that's why that John Wick avatar is so important because, yeah, you're going in there at a surgical local level and you're going to build rapport and you're going to make connections. But the minute you step off that chopper or parachute in, you don't know how you're going to be met. It could be hostile, it could not, and it's very precarious, and it could change at a moment's notice. So a lot of your training, we go through training for over a year. A lot of your training is on survival. It's on, like our medics that we have on a team, they can do an appendectomy on the battlefield. They can prescribe medicine. They can do veterinary work. They can do dentistry. And the reason is because that may be the only medical care you have for 8 months. And so these guys have to be able to do it all. And all of our teammates, engineers, commo guys, weapons guys, they're all like that. And the reason is because you're on your own, and so you're very, very highly trained, Mate, in your ability to understand the operational environment, to read the social tea leaves, and to, if you have to, go to guns very quickly if it's necessary.
Talk a bit more about the 12-person team setup. You mentioned that the medics are different roles. What was the thinking, the design behind it? How does all that work?
Yeah, our origins actually started with what they called the Jedburgh teams, 3-person teams in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. We needed a way to go into Nazi-occupied Europe and basically facilitate insurgencies and disruptions behind enemy lines in order to shape and facilitate ultimately an Allied invasion. And so, of all things, lawyers and school teachers were recruited by these forefathers of special forces in the CIA, or the CIA didn't even exist then. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, and it was the parent for both the CIA and special forces. Guys like Aaron Bank, who they recruited these teachers and parents. In fact, this is how you and I met, but the Canadians were also involved in this. And so there was a Canadian contingent as well. And these individuals would parachute in 3-man teams to Nazi-occupied Europe, and they didn't come out until the war was over. And they would facilitate these insurgent movements. They would link up with partisans and teach them and train them and then go into combat with them. That became the modus operandi for special forces, which was fully activated in 1952. The strategic services shut down. The intel branch became the CIA. The operational branch became special forces. And within special forces in 1952, they formed what are called operational detachments alpha or A teams, not the ones with Mr. T. And they have 12 people on them. It's a NCO sergeant heavy organization with 10 sergeants and 2 officers, a captain and a warrant officer. And then the other guys on the team, you have a team sergeant, you have an assistant team sergeant who does intel, and then you have a Bravo, which is a weapons guy, 2 of them, a senior and a junior. You have a engineer, senior and junior. You have a medic, senior and junior, and you have a commo guy, senior and junior. And what I tell people about these guys, they're amazing. Everybody goes through the Q course for like a year. Your Bravos, your weapons guys can assemble and disassemble any weapon in the world blindfolded. Your engineers can build roads and bridges and then turn around and blow them up. They can do vertical and horizontal construction. Your Deltas, your medics can do battlefield appendectomies, dentistry, veterinary medicine. And then your commo guys they still use Morse code and they can write code. So it's a very, very unique bunch of dudes.
What was your
So I was an officer. I was a captain. I was a detachment commander.
got it,
So
okay.
I had a team under my command, and then I ended up commanding a company where I had 6 teams under my command, and then worked various staff positions in special forces as well. So officers, you don't have, and honestly, officers in my assessment are kind of the most non-essential guys on the team, even though you're the commander. Those NCOs, you got guys on there that have been on a team for 18 years, whereas an officer might be on a team for 2.
Yeah, wow. So, okay, so you had a 20 plus year career in the special forces. You were deployed all over the world. When you decided to retire, what was that like, and what did you end up doing?
Yeah, well, so what led me to retire was in Afghanistan. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, and that was a 20-year war. And my Ranger buddy, Cliff, was killed on 9/11, and I spent the first 2 tours in Afghanistan avenging him and just basically trying to walk the enemy down, basically defying everything I'd learned as a Green Beret. I think, at least for me, there was so much anger after 9/11 and a desire for payback that I think in a lot of ways we kind of lost our focus on by, with, and through in Afghanistan, and we left the door open for the Taliban to do that in the rural areas. So by the end of the war, 2010, not the end, but midway, we decided to get back to our roots, and I was fortunate enough to be on the ground floor of a program called Village Stability, and it was kind of an old school Magnificent Seven style, living in the villages, growing the beards out, really getting back to our roots, and we did that. It was very effective. And then we bailed on that program in 2012 for political reasons, and we left a lot of Afghans who we had made promises to be killed through retribution. And for me, I was a lieutenant colonel at the time. I'd been selected for battalion command, and I turned it down. I just could not stomach the way we left our allies in that program, many of whom I had recruited personally that were killed. And I just decided that whatever I was going to do, I was going to do on the outside of the military. And so I retired in 2013. And I'll be honest, man, I had a very, very crappy transition. I thought as a high performer, starting wars in small countries, being, elite, I would come home. I had a book I was already writing. I had a good job as a contractor. My family was still together, 3 boys still in high school. My wife and I still married. But within like 18 months of getting home and taking off the desert boots and putting on Tampa Bay flip-flops, the snakes in my head started squirming. And before I knew it, this bedroom closet behind me, I was in there holding a pistol and no intention of coming out. And had it not been for a few events that day, I don't think I'd be here, But that set in motion a series of things where I got some help. And one of my mentors got me into storytelling as a modality for healing and making sense of trauma and things that didn't make sense. And turns out that's exactly what storytelling does, but it does a lot more. And I fell in love with it. I kind of, it was a mark in the Herald, it was Mark in the soda shop again, seeing that it's different storytellers using it. And I thought, man, that's what I'm going to do next. And it just opened up a whole new phase of my life in 2015, TED Talks, keynotes, going on the news. And at some point I ended up writing a play and even learning how to act at age 50, all around this thing called storytelling that just redefined my life.
I mean, that's yeah, it's an incredible, incredible story. Like how maybe focus a little bit more on the mental health side of it, like how you're going from, to your point, being a very high performer, and then you're now a civilian, and it's not what you, I don't know, it's not what you expected it to be, and how to, if it, the storytelling piece of it is not the typical therapy one thinks of when you think about dealing with mental health issues. Yeah, how do you think about that now?
Completely different because, I mean, you're right. But the irony is, armies throughout history have used storytelling, and nations throughout history and tribes throughout history have used storytelling as the primary modality for bringing warriors home from war, from combat. All the way, I mean Shakespeare, I mean, way before him, before we even really had written language, we were telling stories 100,000 years ago to crystallize learning from battles and to honor our fallen. And civil societies would bring the warriors around the fire and allow them to tell their stories. And there would be this, because the brain has a mandate to make sense of the world, and it does it through metaphor. It tells itself a story to make sense of things. It has a mandate to make sense. And combat makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense what you're asked to do and what you have to see and go through. And so storytelling is a way in which you can make sense of that over time. And it heals the brain as you do it. Dr. Joan Rosenberg, a psychiatrist in California, U.S. Air Force veteran, says that storytelling heals the brain. It unites the left and right hemispheres in a sense-making endeavor. And look, this isn't just for Green Berets or veterans. Like, anyone who's experienced trauma or pain or grief or guilt or loss. I mean, you look at your journey, right? And what you had to come through coming to the States, and the trauma and the loss and the isolation. I mean, storytelling is how you make sense of it and how you convey that to other people and to yourself. So it first changed me. Like, I was able to say the names of my guys that I lost, and I was never able to do that. I was able to put the details around isolated events where I thought something was my fault, and it wasn't necessarily my fault. It was just a bad day. But it helped me make sense of things, because what stories do, above all, is they provide meaning, context, emotional resonance, and they give us long-term memory. We remember them for long periods of time. And so that meaning and context, man, saved my life, and then once it started to happen for me, then I thought, okay, I found that if I shared my story with others, what I call the generosity of scars, repurposing my struggles, that other people located themselves in my story, and they started thinking about their trauma, their bout with cancer, their transition challenges. And that's the beauty of storytelling at that level, is that it becomes a way in which we can help other people make sense of their own lives. And at that point, man, it was on. Like, I knew that's all I was going to do.
That's so deep, right? And it's your point about the history of storytelling as not just entertainment, but it's a way for people to bond, to heal, to connect with each other. And I'm curious, yeah, because you historically that's been in person, and you went into theater as your mode of sharing these stories. Yeah, talk about that. Was that a conscious choice? You wanted to see the people there, like, well, why? Yeah, why go to theater?
I mean, I look back at, like, when I'm talking to you right now, I'm just thinking, quick, but none of this was ever a plan at all. I mean, a Green Beret typically does not go down this path because we basically work in the shadows, and we don't, you're not on a stage, you're doing your thing, and being the gray guy, honestly, is how you operate. But for me, it was less about theater, and it was more about storytelling as a modality, as a craft, right? And one of my mentors in storytelling, you may know him or heard of him. His name was Bo Eason, and he was a former NFL football player. He was a free safety back in the 80s, early 90s, I think, with the Oilers, and then His brother was Tony Eason, a great quarterback with the Patriots before Brady. But anyway, Bo blew his knee out and he became a storyteller, an actor, because he knew that he had to take this TNT that was inside of him and do something positive with it. So he broke all the norms and became an actor, wrote a one-man play called Run of the Litter about becoming a football player in the NFL against the odds. And then that's how I met him. He was teaching guys like me who had been through trauma, who had been through grief, and how to repurpose their struggles into stories. And for me, it was the Mark in the soda shop thing all over again, and somewhere along the way, that guy conned me into like doing a TED talk and just pushing myself, because the craft of storytelling requires that if you're going to do this in the service of others, you really have to find ways to metabolize the tension in your body and tell stories in high stakes moments. And I found that the people I wanted to hang out with were CEOs and business founders and athletes, but they struggled telling their stories and communicating at that level. So I thought, okay, I'm going to learn how to do this like a Green Beret. I'm going to go on the news. Never been on the news. I'm going to do a TED talk. Never done a TED talk. I want to do 3. And then I ended up coaching. And then just anything that scared me around this modality of storytelling. That was kind of how I approached things as a Green Beret. Like if it scared me, I was doing it because that way I could bring more to the fire. And then at some point, Bo talked me into writing a play about my experiences, telling me it was going to be self-healing and all this other crap. And he knew ultimately I would fall in love with it. And I did. The final thing I'll say on that, and I'll throw it over to you, but at some point in writing that play, I'd never written a play in my life, and I decided to write it about 3 Green Beret team sergeants that were friends of mine that had died in the war and didn't make it home. So I made him a composite character, and then he is mortally wounded in the first scene. He's trying to ascend to Valhalla, the warrior resting place, but he's stuck between his fire base and his living room, and he can't ascend. And so his buddies come down who were killed in combat, call them operators, and they become all the people in Danny's life that made his heart pump the most blood. His wife, Lynn, his son, Caden, his nemesis, Saeed Wali, and his mentor, Malik John. And they become all these characters, and Danny has to go for that full ride, and then he figures out what he's holding on to, and he lets go. It's like It's a Wonderful Life with body armor, is what Mike Rowe called it. But in doing that and writing that, and I felt like it came from a higher place, I fell in love with the idea of telling the story myself. I wanted it to be an all veteran cast, and I wanted to play Danny. I've never classically trained on anything with acting at all. And so I quietly went to New York for a year and studied with Carl Bury, Larry Moss, and they were kind enough and gracious enough to accept me with no chops at all. And then we put the play up on our own. We rented lights and sound and the Marriott Ballroom in Tampa, and we performed the play. And it's in its
What
fourth.
what was that like when you walked on stage that first night?
My God, it was the most terrifying thing. It was so scary because I just kept saying to myself, what are you doing, dude? What in the actual hell are you doing right now? Because everybody to the left and right of me at that point were actors. They had acted. I had not. I'd never done anything on the stage other than speaking. And here I am playing the lead role, in a very intense play that was one act, and I didn't come off the stage. And so it was very scary. And, you know, 300 people in the audience coming to bear witness to my midlife crisis. It was really scary. And then when we did the show, and I honestly, Matei, I went into a trance. I don't remember doing the show. I just remember the lights coming up and just covered in sweat and thinking, and it was silence. And I just thought, oh God, they hated it. And then the place just went nuts, and I just broke down. I just stood there and bawled like a kid. I don't know how long the ovation went on, but when it was over, we sat with the audience and we did a talk back. Bo coached me and he said, it was really important when I did my show that you sit with the audience and you let them talk to you. And we did. If we're talking with the audience, and this young man stands up, and his name was Ryan. He's 18. And he said, I lost my dad this year. He was a Marine. And he said he was my hero. And tonight I got to see him again. And I just walked off the stage. I just grabbed this kid and hugged him. And that's when I knew actually what this was about. That's when I knew. It's oh, it had nothing to do with that ovation. It has to do with this moment right here, because Ryan got to see his dad again, and that's when I'm like, okay, there's really something to this. And I've seen that, Matei, I'm not even kidding you, probably 500 times since then. And
Yeah,
very,
say more about that because you've put on the plate throughout the country. You've had a lot more of those talkbacks. Like, what has the impact been on the audience and the community?
wow. I mean, like we had in New Albuquerque, New Mexico, we had a woman stand up and through tears, and she said, "You guys just showed me in 90 minutes what my baby brother's been trying to tell me for 5 years about war." You know, we had another guy named Corey Breest, who was a medic. We went to this little town of Vermilion, South Dakota to perform the play. And we go to Vermilion, and they're like, this was when the Iraq War was raging. And they went to war, the National Guard unit in Vermilion, and got chewed up in a buzzsaw over there. And one of the guys was a guy named Corey Breest, a medic, married, two little kids. They hit an IED, roadside bomb. Everybody in his vehicle was killed except him. And so we're performing this play in the high school gym, or no, the high school auditorium, right? And everybody in this town has experienced war. And we do the play, and then there's this scene where my character Danny is talking about to his wife Lynn about a silly band that their son Caden gave him, and asked him to keep a magic silly band to keep on while he was in combat. And Danny's telling his wife, "I can't keep this on. These officers are going to tell me to take it off." And she's very superstitious. And she says, "No, promise me you're going to keep that on." And he's like, "Okay, I promise." Well, that actually happened with my wife and me and my son Braden. That's where the writing came from. Well, when we're doing that, my scene partner Aim, I hear Corey in the front row. Now he is partially blind, paralyzed, or paraplegic, and can barely talk. And I can hear him rocking and moaning right in front of us, And I wasn't disturbed because I could tell he was moved. He was into it. He wasn't upset. He was connecting with us, right? So when the play was over, we go out in the lobby, we do the talk back, and his dad has got him there in a wheelchair, and he pushes him up to me, and he got knelt down in front of him. I was like, "Hey, Corey, what'd you think of the play?" And he's smiling, and his dad goes, "Do you know what his favorite scene was?" And I said, "The silly band scene." And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you know why?" "No." "Look at his right wrist." And I looked at his right wrist, and there was a white ring on his skin. And he said, "That's where his daughter's silly band was burned into his wrist. He never took his off either."
Really?
And I'm like, what do you even say to that? But here's the kicker. So we're going to New York at this point, right? We're going to Manhattan to perform the play. And we can't get a theater. You can imagine, right? But we got a little Ukrainian theater, a little comedy club. And we're getting ready. It's like an 80-seat black box theater. We're in a U-Haul van, 28,000 miles on a U-Haul van. We drive to New York. And so we get there and we get this call. And my wife's like, "You're not going to believe this. It's Tom Brokaw." I was like, "What?" And she goes, "Yeah." And so I get on the phone. It's like, "Hey, Scott, this is Tom. I heard about your play." I'm like, "How in the hell did you hear about our play?" And he said, "Well, we have a mutual friend in Vermilion, where I'm from." And I was like, unreal. He said, "Corey Breest." He goes, "I sponsor him." And he goes, "I'd like to do a segment on your play." And so
Wow.
he comes into the Ukrainian theater, like where we're rehearsing, does a segment, comes to the show, opens the show for us. And then that changed everything, that changed the whole nature of it. And then Gary Sinise ended up picking it up. But the point is, like, none of us were trained or prepared for any of that. It was simply a story about a silly band, about mental health, and just sharing it, right? And I think that's been my biggest lesson on all of this is that, our example was theater, but anybody who's been scuffed up, who's been through things, like if you're willing to share your story in the service of others, like there's no ceiling to what you can build or what you can do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think I like the point that you make about how, yes, it's emotional, but it's not so much about vulnerability. It's more about generosity and the impact that you're having on other people's lives.
Yeah, man, that's true. You hear a lot about vulnerability these days, and I get it. I really do. I get it. And I do think that vulnerability is a component in communications, but I think it's been overused. And I think that if you're not careful in this day and age that we live in, if you if you pursue vulnerability as your end game, in other words, if you're going to get up and you say, I'm going to be vulnerable right now. Well, you know what? In my line of work, that's a good way to get your jugular cut back in the day. But I think in the modern world, it is too. What I tell people is rather than focus on being vulnerable when you tell your story or you give your keynote from the stage or you talk about your new product, be relatable, right? Because we're social creatures as humans. That's what wires us. That's what makes us tick is we're always looking to connect with other humans. So I think the intention, if you just set your intention before and during your talk is I'm going to be relatable. I want to make sure I relate to my audience and I just want to focus on them relating to me. And if I do that, then vulnerability will come alongside me in the most natural way and I will be appropriately vulnerable for that engagement. And I think that's a better approach is to let vulnerability be a byproduct of the engagement and let relatability be the foremost intention.
Yeah, well, that's great advice. So, okay, after this play, or in parallel with it, you're doing a lot of other things. You give a TED talk. Maybe talk
Yeah.
about that. How did you end up on the TED?
Well, the TED Talk actually started earlier before the play in that God, I don't even remember how it happened, but I think somebody asked me because I was doing keynotes for veterans and things like that. And I knew I wanted to speak on the stage. That was starting to unfold for me. I loved storytelling. Oral storytelling was my jam. I like writing, things like that, but I love storytelling. And so someone said, would you want to do a TED Talk? And I thought, man, that's really scary. Uh, yes. And so I tried out for it. It was in Santa Barbara, and I went on and talked about rooftop leadership was my first TED Talk, and it did well. Like it went really well. It was a hard process. I tell anybody if you want to do a TED Talk nowadays, especially, it's really competitive, and you really need to work hard at it. You can't be casual. You need to train. It's not just an idea that changes the world. Here's 3 steps that you can do. Like you got to really work at a TED Talk. But I got accepted and I did that talk. And then I did another one in Cincinnati. And then I did another one in my last one in 2019 in Santa Barbara again on my mental health and on the play storytelling called The Generosity of Scars. And that was the TED Talk really that kind of propelled me into the full-time world of storytelling. Like my new book that's coming out in May, it's called The Generosity of Scars, but it's this whole idea of just sitting aside the podiums and the PowerPoint and the neck up communications that we're all trained to do and conditioned to do, and just focus on just being authentic, focus on embodied storytelling from like your chest cavity, not your head, and just really sharing your struggles and your pivotal moments in the service of other humans, being generous with your scars. And that's what I've come to do now. Like, and the TED Talks got me there. The TED Talks proved to me that it doesn't matter what the talk is, it doesn't matter what the industry is. There's certain rules in storytelling and principles. And if you just follow them and you stay authentic and you learn how to design a story and deliver a story with maximum impact, you can own any room you walk into. And so that's kind of, where I am today with it is, and I just keep looking for new ways to do it. Matei, I've got a new play coming out that a one-man play we're bringing to New York in January. And, but for me, it's just all about iterating and continuing to find new ways to reach people using storytelling.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about the new play. It's yeah, it's a one-man play, takes place in Afghanistan and then in the US. It's based on true
Yeah.
events. So yeah, talk more about that.
Yeah. Well, when we were touring the play last out, this was 2019, 2020, Afghanistan started to collapse. Now I'd put the war behind me. I'd been out at this point since 2013. And as we approached 2021, we were putting Last Out up on Amazon Prime. We had filmed it ourselves as a low budget movie. We were just busy with the storytelling stuff, and Afghanistan started to collapse. And my friend Nizam was on the run, and an Afghan commando, and myself and a few other former Green Berets used our phones and relationships to help him get out. And he used the password pineapple to say to the guards that he was given when we got on the phones. And then we we got asked to scale it up and help other Afghans get out through a sewage canal and a 4-foot hole in the fence. and we called it the Pineapple Express. And that book went on to I wrote it, and it became a New York Times bestseller, and kind of changed like the trajectory of our life in the sense that I got very involved again in Afghanistan, very involved with our Afghan allies, even counterterrorism, which I did not want to be involved in at all ever again. But it kind of sucked me back in. And I had to kind of fight my way back out of it. Only very recently have I kind of, reemerged from that whole counterterrorism world and all that. But I felt like there was one thing left undone, and it was this story of the Pineapple Express, the friendships, not just between Nizam and me, but the other veterans like Will, a Green Beret captain who lost both legs in an ambush, and then his interpreter saved his life, and now he was getting his interpreter out. Hasina Safi, the Minister of Women's Affairs, the most wanted woman in Afghanistan, couldn't get out through the State Department. She had to get out through us through a sewage canal. Those stories, I wanted to tell them. And I thought, I've always wanted to do a one-person show. And what if I could be all 18 characters, and do it from the stage, and just like the ultimate test in storytelling. So we started moving the pen last November, and we just finished this past July, and then we've been in rehearsals since September. And the play that we now call 11 Days, the story of Operation Pineapple Express, will premiere in Tampa December 17 through 20, and then we're heading up your way to New York in January.
Well, I can't wait to see it. I think it's what I got out of reading the script is how it's works on so many different levels, even from a business standpoint. What I thought was really interesting is how people solve problems, large problems, in ways where the bureaucracy or the large machine can't, by just being resilient with a small group of people with the sewage canal and the hole in the fence and the password. You figured out a way to achieve something that many more people with a lot more money could not do. And in some ways, that's what you guys do in the Green Berets, right? Is have these like small teams that can solve like massive problems. Yeah, I mean, we can speak more to that, but I thought that was fascinating, and it applies to there's so many contexts, and you're under time pressure. I mean, like, like lives were at stake, obviously, like a much higher pressure than any like business transaction. And yeah, there are some really powerful lessons there.
So many, and you just did a great job of capturing several of them. But the time constraint, time is something that really plays out in both plays actually, but this one, because the clock was literally ticking. The scheduled withdrawal date, but there was also, we knew, an ISIS-K suicide bomber somewhere in that crowd. And so everyone knew you're on borrowed time. And it was this idea of like, how do you call it? How do you say stop? How do these are people that we fought with for years, who many of us are alive because of these allies. And now we were leaving them to be to be exterminated, to be killed on the side of the road, and with no way of really taking care of themselves. Like we pulled everything out, the aircraft, the contractors. And so for us, it was a moral injury. It was a moral injury, an injury of the soul, a violation of one's moral code. One of the worst injuries, I think, that's out there, because it just erodes everything. And it was kind of a Sophie's choice moment for so many veterans is, do I ignore the calls and preserve my own sanity and my own mental health and, frankly, not put myself at risk with my government? Or do I answer the phone the way I was trained to do and be there for my battle buddy and just help any way I can, but also endure financial, personal risk as a result of that? Most veterans answered the latter. But you hit on something that I think is really important, and I think it's universal for anyone watching or listening to this, is what we did to get 1,000 allies out, and what other groups did that got even more than that, was not some kind of advanced special operations training. It was the leveraging of social capital, of human connection that had been built over time when risk was low, and then it was leveraged when the stakes were high. And I think that's the most important thing coming out of COVID and these other things in our life. The next crisis is around the corner. And to me, the most enduring lesson in all of that is human connection is the key to everything. I don't care how sophisticated we get, how advanced we are in our technology or whatever. If you don't have a strong book of business in your relationship portfolio, you're going to be hurting when the next crisis comes around the corner. And you only can build those books of business of social capital when risk is low. You can't build them after the crisis occurs.
Yeah, and it's to your point, it is such a core fundamental. You're talking about loyalty and trust and betrayal, and at the same time, it's like, yeah, you're now in your flip flops in Florida,
Yeah.
where very easy to be like, oh, I didn't see that call. I was out, whatever, running errands when someone calls you. So I guess you have this shared experience with people, but you need to have enough of that in the bank so that when they do make the call, you're like, I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to potentially put myself in jeopardy to help out somebody in ways that are definitely out behind the backs of whatever the regular military was doing at the time. And still, yeah, like you're willing to do that without much hesitation because you know it's the right thing to do.
The right thing to do. And not only that, I mean, it's like one of my buddies, James, said, he's like, you've got these Afghan special operators that they know everything. They know our teams, they know our tactics, they know the names and information of hundreds of our operators. You know what happens when we bail and Russia and China roll these guys up? How many of our operators are now at risk globally? What happens if these guys are co-opted by ISIS-K and put against us in the homeland? Like, you had these veterans and even active duty guys too that were thinking of this in ways that our damn government should have been thinking about. But instead they stuck their head in the sand, or they just loaded everybody up, which was insane. That, taxi cab drivers and anybody that had a pulse was getting thrown on a C-17, which was wholesale irresponsible as well. But you did have legitimately high value, at risk allies who needed to be moved, at least for a time being, until you could figure out what to do next because the withdrawal was so catastrophic. And the veterans knew it. And the worst part was, and I've interviewed a ton of them, and I know how I felt too. I didn't want anything to do with this. I wanted nothing to do with this. I retired in 2013. I'd moved on. I had my life. This thing almost destroyed my business. And granted, nobody had it worse than those Marines and paratroopers in Afghanistan on the wall going through this and went through that horror at Abbey Gate. But there were a whole bunch of veterans and volunteers who wanted nothing to do with this, but they did it because it was the right thing to do for the nation, for our allies. And that's really why I'm telling this story, Matej. The play is set up in such a way that I'm testifying from my backyard in a way that I was not allowed to testify at the House Foreign Affairs Committee for real this time, about the stuff that I didn't have time for, the stuff the committee didn't ask about. And that really comes down to one simple question: is how far would you go to honor a promise? And that's the testimony that I want to give to the witnesses in that theater, so that they understand what this cost our veterans and our allies, so that maybe we don't go down this road again.
Okay, so you testified a version of this story to the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, when people look at politics, it tends to be, I mean, there's partly, it's emotional, you're based on your experience, this or that. But in this case, and especially when it comes to foreign affairs, most people, that to them is just something they watch on TV. And especially, again, even if you travel a lot, you're definitely not traveling to conflict zones during wars, right? So like, you're not going to actually know what it's like there. And then you have you guys, right, that have been there. And not only, it's no longer just an abstraction. It's not just politics. You know people. You've made promises to individuals, and yet it still gets wrapped up in a whole like political umbrella where people on both sides of the aisle are trying to make an example, like push some agenda. Like, well, how is that? I don't know. How does it feel like? What is it like to be in your position to play a political role when to you a lot of this is? I mean, yeah, it was your job, but it was also like personal, and it's moral, and it's things that you've witnessed and participated in with your own life.
It's it's a great question, man. I was disgusted, honestly, by the testimony proceedings. I'd never testified to Congress. And usually congressional testimony is reserved for, 4 stars, you know what I mean? Like admirals and generals and heads of state and, cabinet heads and things like that. I mean, I was a retired lieutenant colonel. I didn't even command at the battalion level. And here I am, testifying to the full committee, on Afghanistan. And they gave me 5 minutes to unpack a 20-year war. And it was a joke. Like, the whole thing was a political stunt, in my opinion. It was not, and I've served under 2 Democratic administrations, 2 Republican administrations, and like a lot of my peers, I pride myself in the oath I took to the Constitution and focusing on the issues of national defense and what I'm directed by the commander in chief to do, like no politics. And in this case, even in my testimony, I said I'm here today, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican, but as a veteran and as an American to tell you what this has done to our nation and to our veterans and to our allies. And when I was done, I felt like it was well received by both sides. But then, and there were other guys that testified that day, like Tyler Vargas, who lost multiple limbs in the attack, and just one of the most gut wrenching testimonies you've ever heard. The grandstanding, Matei, that followed this by these congressional leaders, like just pointing blame at the Trump administration or pointing blame at the Biden administration, when frankly, both of them own it. Biden owns the withdrawal, and he always will. Trump owns the Doha Agreement, which was a flawed agreement to deal directly with the Taliban and disregard the existing Afghan government, which set in motion the conditions for the collapse. Both were underwhelming. Rather than like take personal responsibility for it and go, okay, based on this testimony we're hearing here, what can we do going forward to address this moral injury on our veterans, to ensure that this doesn't happen again for the country, that we don't systemically and systematically abandon our allies? None of that. Just finger pointing. It was disgusting. Like I never wanted to get out of a room so bad in my life. And it's been a big influence for me on this play to tell the story and testify for real, like from the stage, and take 90 minutes to do it this time and do it the right way.
Yeah, it goes back to the power of storytelling and to be able to actually get all this stuff out, do it in a way that's ends up becoming memorable, and hopefully that becomes a part of history.
Well, look at it this way. I mean, you think about the horrific attack on the National Guard soldiers that happened in Washington, D.C. One of them we lost. One of them is still in critical condition by an Afghan special operator who the investigation will reveal, what the motives were and everything. And I'm not going to even pretend to know, but I know that justice should be swift and severe for him, right? I mean, regardless of his background, like it should be. But you now have a wholesale movement in some areas to deport all Afghan allies, to look at them as, through jaundiced eyes as terrorist threats. And I'm sorry, but I don't subscribe to that. I can't imagine what it's like for the families of those 2 National Guard warfighters, but I also know that, Nizam was shot through the face defending U.S. Green Berets, and took 3 more rounds to the chest plate in a unilateral mission against ISIS. Like this guy gave it all, and continued to do so, and was the first guy at my dad's funeral in Kentucky in the church as a Muslim handing out flyers to celebrate my dad's life. And so I'm going to tell that story too, right? Like if we're going to, we have the jackwagon story that shot these 2 National Guard, and that's really unfortunate, but there's also some amazing stories about our allies that need to be told. And that's my point on storytelling, is that there's a saying in storytelling is it's really hard to hate the storyteller. If we give each other the opportunity to share our stories, the potential for shared perspective is massive. And in this time of low trust and disconnection, I think that's what we need more than ever, is shared perspective. And the only way to get that is storytelling.
It's almost like those guys are 2 different people, which is often forgotten that, it's like they're not all the same. They're individuals, and like one could be evil, one can be great. And
Yeah,
that's it's I was just the lazy way to think, is to
it
very
is.
quickly blanket everything instead of trying to understand that,
It
yeah,
is.
this
No
is,
context. There's
yeah.
no context. And that's what I love about storytelling, is it provides meaning, context, emotional resonance, and memory. You remember it. You remember it for a long time. And yeah, I mean, I've yet to find an industry or a setting or an environment where it's not fully appropriate and frankly lacking. So, you know, anybody that's like, if your job is to influence people, teach, inspire, man, you should be training like crazy to be a storyteller.
How much of being a good storyteller is tied to, morality and getting These are really hard questions. Even this example can do a story at some point about this too. You have like two different Afghan immigrants that were both in the war. One goes down a dark path and the other one does great things. And yet, yeah, these are very difficult questions because you obviously, yeah, you can see it's like, yes, it's terrible what happened to the National Guard. And it's it would have been avoided had we not brought any Afghans into the country. But then at the same time, like, yeah, what's the opportunity cost? Like, like you would have let down these people that, to your point, got shot in the face for us, and we just leave them behind. Again, not to mention the longer term ramifications of what happens when you abandon your allies. You then have next time you need somebody and you really need them and you ask them for help and they're like, "Oh, remember what you did to the last person who helped you?" You think about like this, yeah, like the moral complexities and how that impacts what you can do as a storyteller.
Yeah, I think that's really solid. If you think about storytelling it's agnostic. It's a tool. It's a craft. It's available to, I hate to say it, but Hitler was a good storyteller. I hate to say it, but a lot of your gang recruiters are good storytellers. Different individuals who radicalize young people in a mosque or other institution are, pick your denomination, are great storytellers. So it's agnostic, right? As a tool, like it's a tool. And so what I say to people is, what it comes down to is, yes, you can have it. You can be a great storyteller, but there has to be a level of struggle in your life, and you have to have clarity. You have to have moral clarity. I believe you have to have spiritual clarity, and you have to have some sense of what your goals are. If you're really going to move people in a certain direction, you've got to be clear on your goals and their goals. Those are the two things that I think a lot of senior leaders miss today is they're not clear on their goals and they're not clear on the goals of the other party. You can be the best storyteller in the world if you don't know those two things, because the definition of a story is a character-based narration of a character overcoming obstacles to reach an important goal, right? So this, to your point, you've got it's got to be goal oriented, and what are your goals rooted in if not your values, you know? So knowing who you are, knowing who the other party is, and then I'll add one more thing to this. And I found this to be true in sales. I found this to be true in pretty much anything that's client facing or influence dominant, is that often, probably 2/3 of the time, it's not the stories you tell, it's the stories you ask to hear, right? It's thoughtful, open ended questions that allow the other party to respond in narrative to what you ask them with a question that starts with either how or what. And then you listen with pure discovery, pure curiosity to see the pictures in their heads, trying to ascertain their goals and their pain. That's the real beauty there, because if you can do that, then you can start to broaden your perspective of what they value and what their pain is, and then find ways to help them meet their goals, which then brings reciprocity to you. You know, I think that's the real value of storytelling in modern times, honestly, is that it is so perfect for questionology, for the ability to see the pictures in the head of the other party, bring emotional temperature down, and really find out where people are coming from with context, for God's sake. There's no context anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a great segue and plug for the storytelling coaching that you're doing, which I was recently a beneficiary of. It was an awesome 13-week program. More about that. I think it's and there's a couple of things maybe I want you to touch on that resonated with me that I hope would resonate with other people in the investment world or the business world, which is that yes, I think it's obviously very important to learn and do this introspection and tell your own story. But say what you told me about when I asked you the question about whether, like, why don't I just focus on telling my company's story and why that's not actually a good idea and why learning to tell your own story can actually be great in business or whatever else you're looking to do in life.
Yeah, no, I absolutely will. And I appreciate you letting me talk a little bit about that, because I have to say, for me, at 57 years old and having run my race in special forces and then the other places that I've done on the civilian side, what I've found is that my role that I'm here to do on this earth at this point in my life is the world needs storytellers. We need strategic storytellers who can take the mic and speak one to many from the stage, direct to camera, podcasts. I mean, like what you're building with your community, right? I mean, bringing people around the table, right? The tribe and table, these disparate folks from different tribes, bringing them together and letting them be seen and heard. It's storytelling that makes that possible. It's storytelling that conveys that vision. And they did a study, Oxford Analytica did, on great leaders throughout history, from Alexander the Great to John F. Kennedy to Martin Luther King. And the two things they had in common throughout were personal vision and the stories, personal stories that can convey that vision. The reason you talked about why I tell people your company story is great and it's important, but people don't resonate with stories about companies. They resonate with stories about humans. One of the main principles in storytelling is this: what's personal is universal. If it's personal to you, it will have universal value. That's just how we are as social creatures. What happens is you tell your story about growing up and the struggle that you went through and how you had to overcome isolation in your mother country and then come here and carve your way out. When people hear that struggle, they locate themselves in the story and they autobiographically listen. In other words, they're listening to your struggle, but they're actually processing their own lived experience. So you on the outside looking in as a new kid in the school, trying to just like take attention off of you and play down, the economic challenges your family's having. Somebody else is sitting there going, yeah, that happened to me in Mississippi, and they're processing their own. It's called autobiographically listening. Well, that's the power in storytelling because it breeds reciprocity, and people choose Mate way before they choose your idea, way before they choose your company. They choose you, and they locate themselves in your story, and they choose you first as the teller. And that's just the way it is. Like that's communications. Influence requires gaining and holding attention and emotional resonance. So whether you work in finance, whether you work in IT, like the ability to authentically influence requires gaining and holding attention and emotional resonance. Storytelling is the only way to do that. So what I built was a 13-week program where I can take strategic leaders and turn them into strategic storytellers, where they learn how to design and deliver stories from the stage, podcast, television, media, in ways that people can't look away from you, that they don't even remember that they own a cell phone. They're so caught up in your story. And when that happens, man, they're coming. They're going to move. They're going to, and whether that's your associates, your employees, your travel ball team, or prospect, like they cannot look away from the storyteller. And so that's my program. It's called Take the Mic. You really were one of my star pupils. Like your story is amazing. I don't know if you've told it on this podcast, but you need to.
Yeah, and I haven't.
You should. So everybody needs to demand that he does. But like it's awesome. But it gives people a sense of who you are and they want to be around you. And that's what I teach is I teach leaders how to basically take their struggle, their pivotal moments in life, and repurpose them into stories that serve other people and that help them see what's possible for their own life, through your product, through your service, and then your company story comes in behind that, right? After they've chosen you. And it's powerful, man. I love doing it. It's a lot of fun, and yeah, would love the chance to talk to anybody that if you feel like you're kind of in this point in your life where you've run the race, you've been successful, but you've got more to say and you're just not quite sure how to say it, or you feel stuck in how to do it. There's a story in you, but you're not sure how to get it out. That's you're probably right where you need to be.
Like, I think it's I know this is gonna come off as just a testimonial, but it's very, very honest and unpaid. It was what I really like. What's really interesting is that it is exactly to your point. It's personal, and I found myself in random. If it's a sales meeting where I'm talking to a new hedge fund, and these are like very serious, like time crunch people, and you like everything kind of tells you like, don't waste your time with I was born in Romania. These are the things that happened to me. And yet, if you go into a version of that story, it is unlike anything else that they heard or that they're expecting to hear. And it makes it more memorable. It helps you like connect with people. And it's been honestly, it's been like one of the most effective like sales techniques. And same with sales technique. At the end, it's a technique to connect with humans. And the cool thing that I got out of this is to create different modules of this. You have your larger story, but then you can carve it up into different lengths, different components, depending on the audience or where you are, what you wanna accomplish with it. And it's been such a phenomenal, yeah, like icebreaker. It's an easy way, like when I'm at a gala or a dinner somewhere, or just randomly with people, and they ask me like, yeah, some version of like, who are you or what do you do? And I hate those that question, and you just take a step back. It's like, oh, let me tell you a little bit more about who I am. And then you share that story, and then it gets them to open up, and it is such it's a game changer. And it was one of those things where I like telling stories, but I never been coached on it. And it was a mistake. I mean, it was one of those things where I should have done this sooner. Like, you feel like just because you talk all the time that you can't get better at it. That couldn't be further from the truth. And I benefited tremendously from having you there to point out, yeah, to just help guide the story, shape the story, help me think about, like, be meta about the story, and when to use it, when not to use it, how to tweak things. So it's been a really great experience. We're now planning on rolling this out to more of my broader company. I think it helps on all sorts of levels to be able to do this.
100%. And I appreciate those words, but client facing at any level, if you've got to influence, Daniel Pink even says this, he says that, the preponderance of leaders today spend most of their day doing non-sales selling. You have to influence people at work. You have to influence people in your circles. You're still selling. And storytelling, story selling is the best way to do it, because that's how the brain makes sense of things. And if you don't tell your prospect a story, they've done neuroscience research where your listener, your audience, they're going to tell themselves a story, and they're usually going to get it wrong. And they're usually going to be agitated that they had to take a 70 slide PowerPoint deck and make sense of something and use all that brain energy to do it when they could have been told a story. And they're going to tell themselves a story anyway and probably get it wrong. So, like, there's just so many ways and reasons to do it. But the metaphor that I always use is an iceberg. I think I've shown you this in my modules, but the tip of the iceberg is the modern world, and below the waterline of the iceberg is the ancient primal world, where we actually live most of the time in meaning and emotion and social status, and that's where it struggle. And if you can get below the waterline in how you communicate with people through storytelling, the connection is much more visceral, much more lasting, and it'll be remembered. And so your sales rate, your influence rate goes through the roof. And by the way, this is the same thing I still teach Green Berets, federal law enforcement. Like, it's, what works in life and death works better in life and business, but it's a universal thing, man. Like, storytelling, if you can build that skill set, there's no limit to what you can do. You can pretty much move in any direction, because it's just such a powerful tool.
Yeah, and we're also, I don't know, it's one of those tools that if it doesn't get used, there are dangerous consequences. And
Right.
as a society, we haven't been exercising the storytelling muscle as much as we should. We're now, because I mean, this is reflecting on this recently. We have access to such easy entertainment all the time, whether it's on Netflix or TikTok, that we no longer have the need to tell stories. You can just, when you're with family or anybody, you just all sit down and watch someone else tell the story. So we are not exercising this muscle. And I see that even with my kids, when I just want to tell them a story. And it's been phenomenal practice. Like, I now look at this as an opportunity to do the reps. Like, every day
Absolutely.
affords you tons of opportunities to tell all sorts of stories.
It's so
And
cool. Yeah.
yeah,
You're
it's
right.
like, it's awesome. And just being able to, like, exercise that muscle is huge. It's almost as if we were social creatures meant to be sitting around a campfire
Right?
telling stories.
It's almost like we're wired for this. And the other cool thing that you're really good at, Matei, is asking questions that let people tell their stories back to you. Questions of how that start with how and what to your kids, to your spouse, to your client, and let them respond in story, and take absolute delight in seeing the pictures in their head as they tell it, and watch the emotional temperature come down, watch the armor come off, and watch the perspective that you get, because you get the goods, man. You get the real contextual goods on what they value, what their pain is, where they're going, and no one does it anymore. Like you said today on the interview, hey, tell me more about that. Speak more on that. Talk about that. People want to tell their stories, and becoming a good questionologist is a really great way to do that. In my book, Generosity of Scars, that comes out in the spring, I conclude the book with this short quote by a guy named Walter Benjamin, who's highly regarded in the influence world and storytelling. And he says, the art of storytelling is coming to an end. It is as if something that seemed inalienable to us, the securest among our possessions, were taken from us. The ability to exchange experiences. One reason for this phenomenon is obvious. Experience has fallen in value, and it looks as if it is continuing to fall into bottomlessness. And that is what I worry about for my kids and for our junior associates is we're losing the art of storytelling, like we're devaluing it and we're not using it in day-to-day engagements. That's not good for the species, man. Like that's not good when you look at our whole social evolution has been around storytelling. What happens when we start to devalue it in favor of those things you mentioned? And so the smart play, I believe, and I've seen it, man. Like I work in every industry, the storytellers own every room, every single time. And when it gets hard and when the crisis rolls in, they're even more relevant. So again, the ultimate move to me is to develop this skill set, this muscle, so that you have it in all times, big and small.
So we're talking about asking good questions and having a conversation with someone and prompting people to share their stories. I'm curious, as a veteran, how you've written books and plays that are extremely emotional, where you talk about everything from, death to suicide to betrayal, like all the terrible things that get you like, trigger warning labels in the beginning of the movie. And they're obviously very real. They are extremely compelling for people to want to hear those kinds of stories. At the same time, they could be very fragile and raw to talk about. What advice do you have for civilians that are talking to veterans and they have questions, but they might feel intimidated to ask those kinds of questions that can get at the real story? How do you ask while also being sensitive to what other people are going through?
Yeah, I think that's a really thoughtful question. A buddy of mine did a study for his thesis. He's a veteran, saw a lot of combat, and he wanted to explore this idea of transition and, you know, different modalities and approaches to it. And he said that after all his research, I asked him, like, what did you come away with? And he said, well, my general conclusion was, I went in thinking one thing, but I came out completely different, which is most veterans don't need therapy. What they need and what they've always needed from time immemorial since we've had war is they need to have a deep connection with their neighbor. They need to have their stories heard without judgment. And then they need their neighbors to walk that path of healing with them as they come home. And I started thinking about that. I thought, wow, that's really, really profound. And what I have found in terms of a tactical application of that, because it's awkward. There's studies by More in Common that show that something like 80% of civilians today just don't have engagement with veterans because it's such a small percentage of the population. And a lot of veterans don't self-identify, so how would you even know? But what I've found is when you are talking with someone about any kind of a sensitive topic, and this is my background as a negotiator, the first thing that I always like to do is just say what's going on. Just state the obvious. Is something like, look, it's really important to me that you understand how much it means having you live in this community or having you be here. This not the thank you for your service stuff, but what you potentially offer to our community and to having your family here and us learning from you. But I am terrified that I'm going to say something wrong. I am afraid that I'm going to trigger or make a mistake. But at the same time, I want to connect with you and I want to understand where I can play my position. How could I do that? How could I best do that? Can you coach me on that? Can you give me some thoughts on that? I mean, that to me is what I have found to be a very effective way to take the issue away, to just lay it on the table and just ask for help on that. How can I best play my position for you? And, even if the veteran pulls back or hems and haws, you're going to get some insights. And just keep asking questions that start with how and what, or how would you like me to do that? Because again, it's important that I connect with you on this, that I want to be here for you as you come home. But can you coach me? Can you help me see, and I think most veterans are more than happy because maybe they don't know either. Okay, well, I never thought about that. Let me think about it. Here's what really kind of gets me. It's hard for me to talk about this. Okay, cool. You know, but
Yeah.
I mean, I just think and it's one on one, it's local, and it's way past thank you for your service.
Yeah. No, I think that's yeah, it's such a I feel like we would benefit much more from asking harder questions.
Yeah.
And the reality is like it's yeah, like, I've asked questions that I know, like, if even my wife would be like, "What?" Afterwards, she's like, "I can't believe you asked that." But then when you ask it and people start talking about it, you end up having a much better conversation than if you're just always doing small talk, talking about the weather or whatever other bullshit.
I mean, like when we do the play, I can't tell you how many times. I mean, I've had people say to me, well, you're going to trigger these veterans. And I'm like, well, okay, but what do you mean by that? Like they're going to have an emotional response? I mean, we're supposed to have emotional responses to life, you know? And we say before the play starts, this is a play about war. It has lights and sounds and sirens. Do they do that for Hacksaw Ridge? Did they do that for Saving Private Ryan? Are there psychologists in the audience? Like, I think we can have these conversations and we need to, but we need to get back to the art of storytelling. It's like Walter Benjamin said, like the art of storytelling is going away. The art of storytelling is like you and I've talked about, sitting in a circle, or like we did that day in New York when you met my family and friends and you had your associate there and we sat and we literally went around the circle and everybody told their story in the middle of Manhattan. But I don't know about you, but after that was over, I was like, wow, like that was really cool. Like that was a good afternoon and everybody felt a deeper sense of connection. I don't think it's any different with our veterans. I think it's just, taking the time to do it and being willing to do it. And yeah, I think but if you're going to ask a hard question, I would just preface it with something like I'm trying to understand and can you coach me if my questions are off base?
And I think that it's a great point. It's all about intention. And if the intention
Yeah.
is to understand,
Yeah.
and it's not to judge, or you already have the exact opposite of your congressional hearing where the point was not to actually like hear a story and learn from you. Their point was to get their message across at the end, and you're just the yeah. So it's like yeah, if the intention is right, then you can ask all sorts of things.
And you're right, man. And you know what? We can smell it a mile away when someone's intentions are not authentic. We still can. We know in a heartbeat when someone's intentions are inauthentic. And that's why I also love storytelling because authenticity is the number one emotion involved in influence. Is are you authentic? Are they authentic? Because if they are, the levels of resonance can't even hardly be measured. They're so off the charts. And so for me, it's like, okay, how do I just find ways to be as authentic as possible, and to help someone else unpack their authenticity. Because when that happens, woo, man, big stuff happens. Big things happen that were otherwise just not possible around this idea of authenticity, authentic connection. And it's not woo woo. Like they've measured this in Faraday cages, and emotion authenticity comes in like 40 times higher than love in terms of energy emanation. So for me, it's like whatever I can do to be more authentic, that's what I'm going to do. And storytelling's right at the core of it, either listening to them or telling them.
Well, Scott, the place I wanna end this is with one last story, and I really like this story because it's very personal. And as much as we talk about getting coached for business or going up and talking to Congress, the one story that stood out to me from your life that you shared recently is when you coached your dad into giving a TED talk, and you had him share his story with the world. And There's something that we sort of like take for granted. We sometimes take our families for granted, and the stories that you hear around the kitchen table, or the stories you don't even ask for. You may have heard bits and pieces over the years, but you've never actually bothered to like sit down and ask your dad or your mom to tell you more about their story. Tell us that. Like, what was that experience like with your dad?
So my dad, and by the way, if anybody wants to look it up, the TED Talk, he did a TED Talk. It's called if you just Google Rex Mann and tragedy Youngstown TED Talk, you'll see it. But dad, you have to understand it. One, he was my hero. He was a career wildland firefighter for 42 years. He fought some of the biggest fires in the nation's history, and was like one of the top 3 firefighters in the United States Forest Service, and was at the top of his game. But what a lot of people don't know is he was a child of Appalachia, very poor, and had a debilitating anxiety and fear of being in front of people, even though he was a good communicator and a great storyteller. As he got older, he would have these debilitating panic attacks, and I mean, they would shut him down. He got an award for firefighting one time. One of his buddies told this story. I'd never heard it at a celebration of life. Said my dad was hiding in the toilet and called his buddy. He was supposed to get an award, and he's hiding in the toilet. And his buddy had to talk him out of the latrine to go get the award. That's how debilitating my dad's anxiety was about public speaking. Well, then he got cancer, and this made it even harder. He'd just come out of chemo, but his passion in retirement was restoring an iconic American tree known as the American chestnut, a tree that has been part of our ecosystem on the eastern seaboard of the United States, from Maine all the way down to North Florida, and been involved in indigenous and colonial culture, from everything from caskets to coffins, from cradles to coffins. And it went extinct. A blight came over in a foreign chestnut tree in New York City in the early 1900s, and it wiped out billions of our chestnut trees, and they're functionally extinct. The only thing left of them anymore are the roots. But there's been really good science over the last few years that my dad was involved in, and they found a way to restore that tree, to put that tree back in the woods. And it'll be a while, but what's great about it is it represents a way to bring other endangered species of plants back that man-made problems have caused. And my dad, he wanted to do a TED Talk on this. He was adamant about it. And I thought, damn, like, Dad, you're 73 years old. You've been out of chemo for 6 months. Like, you go into panic attacks. You want to get on a TED stage? But he's like, Scotty, I really got to do this. And he said, I want you to coach me. And I thought, okay. So, it was a chance for me to, the old man had given me so many redos in my life on things. I thought, okay, old man, I'll coach you. And I did. I coached him, and we trained. He worked so hard. He worked so hard on his story. And he got up on that stage. And I mean, we had the workups that we had to do with breath work just to keep him grounded. And he got up there and he told this story. And I mean, man, it'll put you in the dirt when you watch it. Like, it is so good. And I had a guy at Capital One come up to me. I told him about the talk, and he's a banker. And he's like, I never thought I could care so much about a damn tree. But for me now, especially that he's gone, he left this world this summer. And, that talk has over 250,000 views. It's raised hundreds of $1,000s for the American Chestnut Foundation. They're starting to put trees out in the woods. And, I'm just proud of him. And I tell people who I coach in storytelling, I'm like, I always tell that story because I want them to know that above anything, this was what I taught my father on the most important thing in his life. And that's how seriously I take it. And I think if you watch his talk, the results speak for themselves.
That's beautiful, and I have seen it. It's a phenomenal TED Talk, and yeah, I also never knew I could care so much about a tree before. Well, Scott, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you so much for sharing all your stories with us.
Yeah, thank you, Matei. You've been just so gracious. And thank you for not just for like what you do to build. Again, you got to tell your story. Like, will you do it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think you should kick off one of your episodes and let people see it. But like what you're building with your tribe, I think is amazing. What you do for our veterans, and a lot of people don't know what you do for veterans. It is incredible. I mean, you just do so much for the veteran community. It just very appreciated.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Scott. We'll chat soon.